So, ladies and gentlemen, this is now the opportunity firing your questions at the panel. Please, Helen.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for your presentations. But I would like to know, as you are only 5 members who represent the 12 members of IFTRIP, what do you feel personally that international collaboration between you all really does to help and assist the other people who are involved in insurance in this room?
Who wants to take that one? Julian, you were just stressing the collaboration that much. Is that a good one for you?
Well, I think from my perspective, what always strikes me is just the similarity of issues that we're dealing with. Just on the topics yesterday, we had a presentation from an academic on the model and what is the most, and she put up half a dozen different types of terrorism model, or catastrophe model, I should say, and they were all different. And I think we all sat there going, which one do we fit into? So I think that the model issue, the gap issue, we talked about cyber terrorism. What is it that we're going to do? Some of us are already covering physical damage from fire and explosion caused by a cyber trigger. Others of us are struggling with how to do that. Competition law issues and how we manage our relationship with the private market. Not to mention, the other gap areas, but also ILS and whether or not there are alternative ways of engaging private capital to deal with terrorism. So I could go on. I mean, there are so many ways in which I get value from talking to my colleagues from around the world.
And that's another subject as well. To learn from each other, that's very important. And that's what is important for us is, to help our clients when they go abroad and say, okay, what are the solutions which are available? And on the other hand, when we have a very progressive pool, the borders are not closed. Our clients will ask us, or brokers will ask us, why is Pool Re providing certain coverage and Extremis does not? So therefore, these exchanging of our views is most important.
I'd like to add that governments are involved in a number of pools by providing guarantees. And so there are pieces of legislation, there's financial support, and processes like this forum to collaborate actually goes a long way to informing government policy and does actually have an influence, in my view, on how governments support markets. So.
Thank you. What's certainly interesting is exchanging of views, being confronted to the same risks. We are faced with terrorism, and we have, in fact, as much as solutions and different formulas as there are countries. So the fact that for instance, we are covering all risks in the pool, life and non-life. Other countries are doing it in that way or in another way, but we are all faced with the same dangers and same threats. So what I personally find interesting is these exchange of experience, to learn from each other and to look if we can take over perhaps or make proposals to our respective governments to improve the systems we have. But we have to consider that we are as many systems as there are countries, and it will be difficult, I think, to find a common denominator.
More basically for me, I think, in the discussion and the talks this morning about cyber exposures, for example, it was very interesting, is before we get to the solution, to the solving of a problem, we have to understand it deeply. That's the first step. And we all very smart in our countries, but I feel we are smarter together, trying to understand it better before we get into finding solutions. Very often we are focused on the solutions before understanding exactly what it is all about. So IFTRIP will help us, I guess.
Hello there, Ravim Ismail, Fractal Industries. I mean, having reinsured some of the pools previously and seen the heterogeneity of every country having its own system, given that we experience new risks like cyber, and GDPR is now on the radar for EU data protection, etc., would new risks like cyber fall under separate entities or the same entity as yourselves in your respective countries? And is there scope for greater European collaboration and hence continuity, homogeneity, so that it's easier for the insurance world to take that risk and indeed to securitize it down the line?
Who likes to take that one? Is it?
I'll start with a partial answer. I think it would depend on the country and the political objectives and the market needs in each environment. I think that to me it doesn't matter whether it's a separate pool or in the same pool. As Pierre said, it's about trying to deeply understand the problem and proposing solutions. I don't think we should be so focused on trying to necessarily add them to existing infrastructure. But obviously many pools are quite efficient in the way they operate. I think they were set up, as I said, certainly in ARPC's case as a temporary arrangement, but it's actually proven over time to be quite an effective way to deal with the risk. So I haven't answered your question, Raveen, but I think it would depend.
Yeah, I'll just add a word, and I'll thank you very much, Raveen, for asking a question that I understand this year as well, because I struggled last year, I know. But I would say, as you know, Pool Re wants to add physical damage from a cyber trigger into its coverage, and I think it's absolutely appropriate that it should be there. The only reason it's not there is historical accident. As for, however, what you heard from Victor Penier this afternoon, it's really, really hard to separate it out. And so, to the point that I made earlier, if you had a cyber re type structure, that may well be a way of getting the market more comfortable with the risk, and therefore allowing it to deploy as much capital as it could, knowing that it was protected from, let's say, tier 1 risks, which could wipe its shareholder capital out.
More questions? Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about what you all do, I mean, the pools and the schemes, if anything, with respect to incentivizing prevention behavior? I know I'm familiar with what Pool Re is doing, but I'm very curious about whether that is a best practice or something that's going to be picked up in other parts of the world.
When I may, we simply have not the means of Pool Re. Julian mentioned that he's sitting on more than £6 billion of pounds sterling, and I always reply to him, we are pool boys at the block. Our job is simply to provide coverage, and we even don't have access to research of services, secret services of the police. We simply provide the cover, and what we do is we instruct our clients what cover would best suit to them. But in prevention, I believe that's a huge field, and there are already some experts around, and there is. I'm not seeing that as a future activity of extremists.
Can I add to that? Just it is something that will be specific to each pool or scheme, but in ARPC's case, risk prevention is very much one of our strategic objectives, which we're at the early stages of, and certainly Pool Re is far more advanced on this journey. But I think one of the things that's missing in insurance markets is a standard for risk mitigation, and one of the things that ARPC is doing at the moment is exploring with Standards Australia, which is the organisation that endorses standards, whether there could be a risk mitigation standard for physical damage, for example. And if that could be established, then there could be an argument for linking it to a premium adjustment. But that's certainly one thing. And the other area that's very interesting is, I mentioned briefly in my comments that the Attorney General's Department in Australia is looking at supporting and funding programs on countering violent extremism and social cohesion. I think there's a role potentially also in risk mitigation through supporting those sorts of community programs.
There's one more question.
Gordon Wu from RMS. Everyone is concerned about the impact on tourism of terrorist attacks. Can you just clarify what insurance protection there might be for foreign visitors or tourists who may be injured in the event of a terrorist attack? What kind of compensation might they be able to get insurance terms?
Mark, do you
Yes.
want to-
Okay. Thank you. But as far as Belgium is concerned, we are covering the Belgian risks, and the definition of the Belgian risk is coming from the European Community regulation. And as a Belgian, as you are going abroad, you are still covered because we are covering the Belgian risks. And people are considering when they are traveling as Belgian risks. So if you are a Belgian and you are going to Paris, and that happened when there was that attack in, not in Paris, but in Nice, we had a Belgian who died, and he was covered by the pool, by the insurance company, and by the pool.
What
So,
about a British person in Belgium?
pardon?
What about a British person in Belgium?
A British person in Belgium, he will be reported to his English insurer. If you if you are talking English but you are a Belgian, of course it's a bit a joke. You are covered. You are covered, of course. No, it's a matter of defining the Belgian risk. Belgian risk are the persons and the industries which are located in Belgium. What do we have in addition? Yeah.
When I may assist you, Mark, to reply to your comment, we still have on terrorist attacks. We had this discussion this morning. There's no liability part in it, and we still have a condition in principle that you have to go for your own risk prevention. When you buy a life insurance to protect your family, when you buy personal accident insurance, then there's no exclusion there. Then you will be covered. But when you don't buy any insurance, then you have to hope that one of these national compensation funds or whatever, like the Verkehrsopferhilfe, they will compensate. But you need some of these state funds.
I think it's obviously a wide range of situations, but maybe jumping to the next question.
Yes, thank you. I'm Bruno Felix from Axis. I have a question to the CEO of Puri and about his comment in relation to the Westminster and the London Bridge attacks, and his comment that motor insurers do not price for terrorism. Do you think that the motor insurers in the UK will pick up the claims?
Oh, sorry.
And maybe I have the same question to the German representative too, for the terrorism attack.
Okay, go first. I think in the UK it's fairly simple, if it can be simple. I think for those two instances, they have to pick up the claims because that's what the legislation says. The point I was making is whether or not they will now look at the situation that they're faced with and begin to either sublimit it or exclude it or price for it. But that's a looking forward perspective. I think for what's happened so far, I think they have no choice but to pay those claims.
Dirk, do you want to add something?
I believe in this respect, we had this discussion yesterday on the closed session, and my colleague Bernhard Krause will be able to answer this, because it was quite an interesting case in Berlin. You know, this was the Polish truck which has been stolen, and actually even the driver, the Polish driver, has been killed, and then they went on the truck. So because the truck has been stolen, I believe, Bernhard, this is the right answer. The motor liability insurance didn't come to play, but it was then the Verkehrsopferhilfe to compensate. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a reason for the Verkehrsopferhilfe. There was one question over there.
Given the difficulty of having a certified act of terrorism, do you think that cyber may be better worked in as a separate pool instead of inclusion into a terrorism pool? Because when you do have a cyber attack, you may not ever know who it's from, and it could be a kid in their living room down the street, or it could be North Korea. You never know. So I was just wondering your thoughts on whether you still think that in the future cyber would be better worked into your pools, or if you think it would be better as a separate pool.
I'd like to have a go at that. I think there's two answers to it. So the first is, we haven't discussed it today, but Julian briefly mentioned that the cyber exclusion is an accident of history. I think these, I was talking to Steve Coates on it yesterday, I think these things emanated from exclusions for electronic equipment insurance in commercial property policies. And so from that perspective, I think that it's not efficient to have a computer exclusion. I think personally that the vector of attack, how the attack happens, shouldn't impact whether you can make the claim. And so why should a drone attack be covered but not a computer attack? So that's one answer. But your point's a good point, because it is perverse that an act of war would not be covered, an act of criminality may be covered, and an act of terrorism would not be covered. So there's sort of three different perspectives on cyber at the moment.
I think we are one final question maybe, because it's past. I mean, the coffee gets cold. So you've got one final one. Otherwise, I will pick one, because I mean I picked up the pressure of the governments. I mean, and I think you are mostly affected by the governments because they are stakeholders of the pools in most cases, or if they are not pools anyway. So maybe do you want to comment on that? So what do you really currently see as a pressure coming up from the governments as a very important stakeholder, the French government maybe?
Pressure. Who's putting pressure on who? No, we have the pressure of being obliged to provide coverage to the market with no exclusion at all. So we have this pressure, and we are not able to bear this burden without the government involvement. It's not possible. It would not be possible. Or we would have to set up a scheme that would require a change in law that would allow us to reduce, for example, the limit of indemnity. That's not the case today. Whatever the amount of the loss is, we will have to cover it. So I feel that we also share this pressure with the government because of this scheme and the fact that it's not possible for us to get along with that. The pressure is shared. Now, we've always end up with an agreement on how to cover, how to arrange and modify the scheme to be able to keep on providing coverage and the full protection on the market, because it's very important. On the French market, you're very well protected thanks to the law and thanks to the scheme that we set up with Gariat, and thanks to the state guarantee. So I would say the pressure is shared.
Thank you. Sounds like a good closing remark. On behalf of the audience, I thank you for your time and for the contributions. Thank you very much.